Nicole here, just enjoying and sharing the intersection of three of my favorite things: knitting, books, and travel. When I picked up Knitting 24/7, 30 projects to knit, wear, and enjoy on the go and around the clock by Veronik Avery from the Watertown Free Public Library, the thing that actually convinced me to check it out was the list of places and times to sneak in a few rows. It made me smile to realize how many of them I have done, thankful for the ones I hadn't thought of yet, and made me remember a few places that I have snuck in some rows that didn't make it on Veronik's list. Like when I was knitting while pushing a shopping cart while shopping at Christmas time, finishing up a project for my brother. While packing for a last-minute trip to Montreal, I decided to bring Knitting 24/7. It seemed highly appropriate for a road trip. And when I got to the end of the book, I noticed on the back flap that Veronik Avery actually lives in Montreal. Even more appropriate than I had realized. Question to answer. Who would I recommend this book to? Any knitter who is constantly looking for a project to pull out and work on without too much concentration needed. There are so many great options to choose from in this book. Let's jump into some of my favorite quotes, patterns, tips, and tricks from this book. Favorite quote number 1. When I have a project in my bag, I don't even mind a long commute or having to wait in line. In fact, I even get excited knowing that a stretch of uninterrupted knitting time awaits me. Quote number 2. Many of us like to knit while we travel, wait, watch, or listen, and times like these calls for projects that can be easily stowed in a bag and contained in our laps. They also call for easily memorized stitch patterns so that charts are not needed once the pattern has been established. We make time for what we want to, and knitting is one of those things for me. I appreciate how this book provided me with tips and tools for how I can build more knitting into my life. What can you expect from this book? I have organized the patterns into AM, PM, and weekend, as these are often the categories that define our wardrobes. Section 1. AM. There are 2 patterns from this section that I want to make. The modern pillow, it has color work that you steek, so you do the color work in the round and then cut it to make the pillow, and there's cool buttons on the back. I'm excited to test out this project. And the second is arrowhead socks, knee-high socks. So they have a different panel up both sides of the socks that is similar to a project I did in Literary Knits, a vest I made for my dad. The sides are supposed to help them fit better, and I'm curious to see if this works as well in the socks as it did with the sweater vest. Sometimes I am more interested in the story behind a pattern or a particular stitch pattern that they use than I am in actually making the item. Is that just me? But there are a few from this section that are like that for me. Like the patterned mittens on page 15. They were inspired by some fabric she saw, which I think is just a cool place to find inspiration. And I love that the thumbs of these mittens are actually one of the accent colors and not the main background color. The cross-stitch lounge socks on page 19 has a double wrapped slip stitch, which I've never seen or heard of, and I'm very curious to test out this stitch pattern. The Transitional Scarf on page 31 uses a yarn material that I've never heard of before. Tencel? And now I must know more about it. And once again, reading is expanding my mind or teaching me new things or causing me to research more about them. Plus, this scarf is done in 2 halves. So you work both from the bottom up and connect them in the middle. And this allows the pattern on both sides to be going in the same direction. Section 2, PM. The list of where or when to sneak in a few rows from this section has my favorite that I'd never thought of before. Between ice cream and bedtime. This section has 3 patterns that I would like to make. The leafy knot clutch on page 57. I've discovered I really like projects where you do one part of it and then pick up stitches from there to start a different part of it. which this clutch does. The Elemental Pullover on page 67 is so elegant. I definitely want to make it. And also, when I was showing this one to my backseat road trip buddy, I was explaining how it's actually knit just without any seams. So you do the arms and then the body bottom up and then connect them to do the yoke. And his response was, totally tubular. The third pattern I want to do is the linen market basket on page 71. It uses a technique of moving the stitch markers every 6th row. So you start with this as your beginning, and then 6 rows later you move it over. I love any time a stitch marker can be used to make knitting easier and require less conscious attention while knitting. Plus, I learned a new fun fact about linen. As much as 3 times stronger than cotton and with a lovely natural sheen, linen is an ideal fiber for such heavy-duty use. Here are a few additional interesting and helpful things from patterns in this section. The spiral tweed cloche on page 53 has this helpful note. For optimal fit, choose a size about 1 inch larger than actual head circumference. A gross grain ribbon sewn inside the hat once it's completed will make it conform to the actual head circumference as well as create the brim. I am glad to have this ribbon sewn inside the brim of the hat trick tucked into my memory so I can pull it out the next time I make a hat that doesn't fit quite right. The Smocked lace scarf on page 75 is like the transitional scarf from the AM section where it's knit in 2 panels and then connected. But this time she used the 3-needle bind off on the right side so it becomes a decorative element in it. I thought that was cool. I've never thought of using the 3-needle bind off as a decorative element in knitting. Have any of you ever done that? Share in the comments below. Finally, the ostrich plume stole on page 79. This one compared it to something I'd never heard of, a Shiboni scarf, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So another thing that I get to learn more about, and it uses a different kind of bind off than I've ever heard of before. The stem stitch bind off, and I'm looking forward to testing that out as well. Section 3, the weekend. The pattern I definitely want to make from this section is a rope and ladder headband on page 109. It's super cute and it uses a slip stitch approach or stitch pattern that I've never done before, so I'm excited to test that out. There are 2 additional stitch patterns I want to make swatches of to learn. The English mesh lace pattern from the mesh layering tank on page 97 and the gull wing pattern from the redwork cowl and mitts on page 101. This section has tips and tricks about socks that I want to remember and apply. The toe-up traditional sock pattern on page 93 has you start by dividing the yarn in half. Then you do the toe and knit until it's as long as you need for the foot you're knitting for. Turn the heel and then just keep knitting until you run out of yarn. Repeat that with the second sock. Heel reinforcing can also help extend the life of your socks. So she uses a slip stitch approach in this toe-up pattern that adds additional fabric in that area. Similarly, the lacy cable sock pattern on page 113 has another approach for reinforcing the heels. The heel flap is worked in garter stitch with all stitches knitted through the back loop. This prevents the garter stitch from expanding and is a great way to reinforce the heel. Have you ever noticed that once you become aware of something, you see that thing everywhere? I was introduced to the Latvian braid in my last book review, and I thought to myself, this would be really cool to have at the bottom of mittens or fingerless gloves. Enter Helio mittens on page 105, which uses the Latvian braid for their cuffs. Learning from other people is great, and so is learning from your own mistakes. The fleur-de-lis hat on page 87 was a time that this happened for Veronik. She was trying to make a straightforward ski hat and realized she'd cast on too many stitches. But before she scrapped the whole thing, she took a step back and she realized she could make something different and new out of this mistake. I really appreciated this reminder that sometimes great things come out of our mistakes. When things are designed to be easy to customize, it makes me really excited. So I love what Veronik had to say about her acorn tea cozy on page 91. I designed this cozy with a simple 2-stitch repeating pattern that is easy to customize. Simply add or remove pairs of stitches on the front and back to fit the circumference of your teapot. The appendix section of this book is quite short, but packed with good information, especially the special techniques section. Here is what she covers and uses throughout her patterns in the book. I am looking forward to playing around with these special techniques, especially Kitchener 2.0, connecting live stitches to a finished edge. Say what? And also the 3-stem bind off. Stay tuned for some follow-up videos. Don't want to miss them? Subscribe to my channel and click that notification button so you get alerted. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you learned something new or that you were inspired to check out this book or any other book from your local library. And until next time, happy knitting!